All right, to continue on with the roots of American democracy, let's look at the English thinkers, also known as philosophers. So the two English thinkers or philosophers that I want to focus in on are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Both men helped to develop this social contract theory, which pretty much stated that people in a society agreed to give up some of their freedom to governments in exchange for security and order. So Hobbes argued that people entered into a social contract, and in this contract, the people are obliged to give up some of their freedom by agreeing to obey an absolute ruler, such as a king. And in exchange for this pledge of obedience, that ruler or king then agreed to bring peace and order to society. Hobbes was not actually promoting the idea of democracy in his writings, but what ended up happening is his whole theory on this social contract did end up laying the groundwork for the ideas that government was formed by the consent of people, which is one of the main foundations of our government. So then John Locke took this idea of social contract between the people and their rulers a step further. And Locke argued that in a state of nature, all people were equal and that they enjoyed certain what he believed to be natural rights, which natural rights are rights that are people are given or have by just being the virtue of being a human, okay? So just things that we're naturally born with. And to him, natural rights included the right of life itself, the right to liberty, and in this time period, which we changed it a little bit, it was the right of ownership of property. Okay, so it goes back to John Locke, natural rights, and that's where you kind of get life, liberty, and during that time period, it was property. So the idea that the purpose of government was to protect the right of the people pretty much came from these two English philosophers. Okay, so we had Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and to those of you who were assigned them for Friday's activity in class, it's a little bit of an intro on them. The next two that we're going to look at are French thinkers, and first being Montesquieu and the other being Rousseau. And they definitely contributed with their political thought to the foundations of our government. So Montesquieu argued that government should be organized in a way that prevents any one person or group from dominating or oppressing others. And his argument then led to the proposal of a three-branch system of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, each having separate functions for each branch. And in this system, each branch would act to limit the power of the other branches. So this principle of separation of powers was very admired by Americans, and they definitely applied it to their colonial governments. Montesquieu, in my opinion, was genius. Rousseau is the second French thinker we're going to talk about, and he added that the idea for government formed by a social contract was to have legitimacy, but this legitimacy must be based on popular sovereignty. So pretty much the thought that people had to choose their leader. So it goes with the foundation of the United States history, but it goes a little bit against the time period in which he lived, because for a majority it was kings, and kings were not chosen by their people. Okay. Many colonial leaders then agreed with Rousseau that government should be based on the will of the people. All right, let's do a really quick, brief summary of the American Revolution. So we had that the most of the 13 colonies were established under royal charters issued by the king. These charters gave ultimate power to the king and his appointed officials. But because the colonies were so far from Britain, the charters left a significant amount of local control in the hands of the colonists themselves. So by the mid-1700s, the colonies were accustomed to managing their own affairs. Although Britain provided defense and a market for products grown or produced in the colonies, it rarely interfered with the day-to-day business of government here in the original 13 colonies. In the 1760s, though, this changed, and Britain kind of reversed this policy of benign neglect by they started to enforce taxes and restrictions on the colonies. Well, when they had gone so long without interference, this obviously made them upset. And this change came about after the French and Indian War, which was a war that was fought against France and its Indian allies on North American soil. There's actually a good YouTube video. This guy's a little crazy, but he gives a really good, brief, like 11-minute summary of the American Revolution. So if you want to check that out, you can go to that link. So just to kind of summarize it a little bit more, out of the fighting and the breaking away came the Declaration for Independence. Then we had the Continental Congress, which was serving as our government during this time of war when we had broken away from the British and were really taking control. And Congress had appointed a committee to prepare a plan of government, which would be known as the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so framing the new Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. It was a federal thing, so it was a national thing over all 13 colonies. So individual states then also needed their own constitution. In framing their new plans of government, state lawmakers demonstrated their commitment to constitutionalism, which is the idea that government should be based on an established set of principles. These principles would include popular sovereignty, limited government, the rule of law, and majority rule. The lawmakers also separated the powers of government by creating an executive, legislative, and judicial branch, just as Montesquieu had described. So governing under the Articles of Confederation, it was created again by the national government, and it ended up being much weaker than what the state governments were establishing. So that's going to cause conflict and issues. So a pro of the Articles is that the Articles emphasize that each state would retain its sovereignty, its freedom, and its independence. So they could declare war, they could negotiate with foreign countries, and they could establish a postal system. Cons were that it couldn't carry out laws, it didn't have a judicial branch to settle disputes between the states, and it couldn't impose taxes, which meant it was often starved for funds. So for the most part, the government that they had created within the Articles of Confederation was a failure. It lacked the power to levy taxes, which they needed during this time of war. It also didn't give Congress the right to raise the funds that it needed to support the army. It had to borrow heavily to fund the revolution. So after the war, the Articles of Confederation were so weak and didn't give the right powers needed, they really couldn't raise the funds to repay the different debts of the war. Okay, so by 1786, it was clear to many that the nation's leaders that the government formed under the Articles of Confederation was not working. So that fall, representatives from various states met in Maryland to discuss trade issues. While there, they issued a call for the Constitutional Convention to meet 1 year from then in Philadelphia, and they wanted to really kind of rewrite the Articles of Confederation. So in theory, the purpose of the convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Once the delegates met, however, they decided to completely scrap the articles and they wanted to create an entirely new constitution. Okay? I was supposed to insert a table that went over the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, but I forgot to do that, so I'm sorry. So in 1787, I didn't do that because that's one of your assignments this week. So within the reading notes, you have your tasks, and that's one of the tasks. That's why I didn't do it. I'm genius. Okay, so 1787, the Constitutional Convention meets, and you have delegates from all these different states that kind of come together. They met in the same room in which the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years before. So these 55 delegates that came together were prominent in the American political life. All were white men. Among them were former soldiers, governors, members of Congress, men who had drafted state constitution, and their average age was about 42. Okay, they have all these different plans because obviously you put 55 men in a room, they're all going to want something a little bit different. So I'm going to briefly cover the different plans. We had the Virginia Plan, which was written by James Madison, and it was clearly designed to replace the Articles of Confederation, not revise them. It called for a government of 3 branches. They wanted the legislative branch would make the laws, the executive branch would carry out the laws, and the judicial branch would interpret the laws. So then we had New Jersey, and they introduced an alternative approach, and this was known as the New Jersey Plan, and it proposed a series of amendments or changes to the Articles of Confederation. So it wasn't completely scrapping them like they'd wanted. These changes would have created a somewhat more powerful national government with a unicameral or one-house legislative in which all states had equal representation. That's going to cause some issues because different states, different sizes, different populations. Is that really fair? So the final plan was proposed by Connecticut, and it's kind of a compromise that was meant to kind of satisfy both sides of the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. So it called for a bicameral legislative with a different form of representation in each house. And in the Senate, states would have equal representation, but in the House of Representatives, states would have representation based on their populations. So this plan, written by Roger Sherman, was known as the Great Compromise, and it resolved the different issues of representation in Congress, and it allowed for the convention to move forward because between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, they were kind of deadlocked. So the Virginia plan had some good attributes. The New Jersey plan had a couple, not as many. But so what he did is he kind of put them together and came up with the Great Compromise. So then they have to talk about a couple other big issues, so slavery and commerce. So there's other issues that were then also dividing the delegates. Those from the northern states differed sharply with those from the southern states in questions on slavery and commerce. So commerce, think trade. So many northern delegates wanted the Constitution to include a provision for abolishing slavery. But most Southerners opposed ending a system of labor in which their agricultural economy depended. They needed the slaves. So these differences over slavery spilled into debates on representation and taxes. And since most slaves lived in the South, delegates from the South wanted slaves to be counted when determining representation in the House of Representatives. Yet, they did not want slaves counted when determining each state's share of taxes to support the national government. Those are very conflicting things. So looking at that, then in contrast, the delegates from the North wanted slaves to be counted for taxation, okay? If they can be counted as votes within the representation in different houses, then they should be counted for taxation. But then they wanted an opposite, but they didn't want them to be counted when determining that actual representation. After much debate, though, the delegates reached another important compromise for purposes of both representation and taxation, and a slave was to be counted as 3/5 of all, quote, free persons. So the 3/5 compromise helped hold the new nation together, and however, by treating a slave as less than a free person, the provision contradicted the basic ideal of equality set forth in the Declaration of Independence. And this contradiction between democratic ideas and the cruel inequality of slavery would then haunt the nation for decades to come and would eventually result in the Civil War. So something that they thought was a good decision in the time and they thought was a great compromise for the time is actually going to lead the nation into a civil war where they almost break apart. Okay, so then let's look at this creating of what would be known as the executive branch of government. So some delegates wanted a single executive to head the government, while others were concerned that giving power to a single leader might give rise to a monarchy or tyranny. So instead, they favored an executive committee made up of at least 2 members. In the end, though, that didn't pass, and the delegates voted for a single president. Okay, so how would we choose this then president was something that they were plagued with. Some delegates thought that Congress should do it, while others favored popular elections, popular sovereignty. So they finally decided to set up a special body called the Electoral College, and this body was made up of the electors from each state who would cast votes to elect the president and the vice president. So each state would have as many electors as the number of senators and representatives it sent to Congress. Adding the 2 senators to the number of electors from each state boosted the influence of small states and of those with large slave populations. So then ratifying the Constitution, making it legit. So the Constitution included a provision for ratification. To go into effect, the new plan of government would need to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. Ratification was